We've got the latest proposed changes to your retirement. You may want to pay particular attention to this program because the folks in Washington, once again, are talking about how they might change the rules on retirement and retirement accounts, which means that you better hold your wallet. We're also going to talk about some of the signs that you need to be aware of to make sure that your retirement is on track. So all that and much, much more on today's program. Welcome to Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. We're Central Florida's longest running radio program, also happen to be one of the top 25 financial planning podcasts on the World Wide Web. So if you miss us on any of the networks that we're on here in Central Florida, and it's a long list, so this segment will welcome in our listeners on News Radio WFLA Orlando. But if you missed the program, you can always catch the podcast on any of your favorite social media or podcast channels of choice. And then, of course, my name, Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary with Nelson Financial Planning, where our team of certified financial fiduciaries stands ready this week to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. So, hard to believe, welcome to August, right? August 1. Where'd those first 7 months go? It went by pretty quick on this end, and usually that means they're going by quick for everybody. Trying to gear up at the office for the fall, trying to figure out what that looks like, trying to bring back client events. If you're a client of Nelson Financial Planning, you know that we have quarterly educational meetings. They're usually in a ballroom setting with a speaker, dinner, stuff like that. Trying to figure out how to bring those back for the fall. We also like to do a big celebratory event, usually at a unique venue in Central Florida. Trying to figure out how those are going to come back into play. Was feeling pretty comfortable about bringing them back into play 6-7 weeks ago. Now, particularly with those headlines at the top of the hour, not feeling quite as comfortable with that. So, folks, just go out and get the vaccine so we can all move on appropriately. My goodness, the numbers are just pretty disturbing these days. When you start to hear some of those numbers that were at the top of the hour. So go get shot up. What the heck? Why not? What else you got to do on a Sunday? Anyway, speaking of what's going on out there, the refunds in Washington continue to fly out. Last week, it was a few weeks back, we were talking with one of our associates, was on the program, Kristen Cayley, who's our in-house CPA, also a certified financial fiduciary as well. And we were talking about the changes to the child tax credit. The increase in the child tax credit that passed earlier this year basically is getting paid out in a series of monthly checks between now and the end of the year. So that was the big push to get those checks out and to get those checks out on a monthly basis, almost like a supplement to income, if you will, particularly with how much the child tax credit ultimately expanded under that legislation that passed back in March of this year. There's another round of the refunds coming out, and this doesn't have anything to do with anything that applies to this year. It has everything to do with something that applied last year. And so it's estimated that this latest round of refunds is coming to about 1.5 million taxpayers, and the refunds are averaging over $1,600. In fact, $1,686 is the average refund. So now that I've got your attention that there's money flowing out of Washington, how do you know if you are eligible for this latest round of money from Washington? Well, this round has to deal with the unemployment compensation and the taxation of that. We've certainly talked about this on prior episodes. There was a late, it was in March, in the middle of filing taxes for 2020, and it was retroactive to the year 2020, and it had to do with unemployment compensation. So Under the current rules, or prior to March, unemployment compensation was taxed as ordinary income. So what that meant is that if you got it, you had to put it on your taxes, and then you had to pay income tax on it. Well, with the legislation that passed in March of this year, it actually made unemployment compensation tax-free as long as your income was below $150,000. Well, if you pass legislation that changes stuff for 2020 in March of the following year, what happens is you have millions and millions and millions of people who already filed their tax return under the old law. And so what they were told was that, don't worry, don't file an amendment. We can't process them anyway. We're millions and millions of returns behind anyway. So don't flood us with amendments. Just wait. Well, the good news is the wait is finally over for those folks who filed early and paid taxes on their unemployment compensation, because the IRS just went through and at the end of this past week on Friday wound up pushing out those refunds. So to see if you're eligible, one of the things you probably want to do is just take a look at your prior year tax return, particularly look at when you filed it. If you filed it early, like in February or early March, chances are you wound up paying tax on your unemployment compensation. If you filed it later, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, depending upon what software you were using and whether it was updated appropriately. So just double check that. If you're seeing that you paid taxes on your unemployment compensation, then certainly keep an eye out for a refund check, because as the IRS said, we'll get to it. Eventually they got to it. What is that? It's April, May, June, July. It took them 4 months to get to it, but they got to it. And those checks for that change in the unemployment compensation and the taxation of unemployment compensation are in fact on their way. So that applies to you. Make sure you're keeping an eye out for that additional amount of money coming to you based upon that late tax change for unemployment compensation. Speaking of Washington, one of the things that is floating on through is Secure 2.0. Now, if you're familiar with Secure 1.0, that was the legislation that passed in late December of 2019. Golly, you just got to love Washington for the wonderful names that they come up with to put on legislation, and then create neat acronyms from them, right? I sure hope they're not spending a lot of time or paying a lot of consultants to come up with this stuff, but they do have a knack for kind of making the title of the act really sound good in order to sell it to the media. So the Secure 1.0, which is what it's getting referred to as, was the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act. You got the S, the E, the C, the U, the R, the E. Pretty clever, right? So that was 1.0, passed in December of last year, and ultimately, or December of 19, and then ultimately now they are coming back around and looking at doing a Secure 2.0. That one is titled Securing a Strong Retirement Act of 2021. So isn't that the cool little acronym thing going on? But it's basically getting referred to as Secure 2.0. And ultimately, it's going to make some significant changes to your retirement. So we're going to talk about all of those changes that are on the table under Secure 2.0 that has actually passed through the House Ways and Means Committee unanimously, which means that if it got through the House Ways and Means Committee unanimously earlier this summer, chances are we'll probably see this pass as legislation. So we're going to get into the details on that in our next segment, coming up here on Dollars and Cents. On the program, we're talking about some of the proposed changes that are coming out of Washington this summer, particularly involving your retirement. It's called Secure 2.0. Secure 1.0 passed December of 19. Biggest change on that one, if you recall that one, was an increase in your required minimum distribution age to age 72 and the death of the stretch IRA, which was a pretty significant hit from a beneficiary perspective in terms of the flexibility that they had previously to take out money from an inherited retirement account over the course of the rest of their lifetime. Now they only have 10 years in which to do that. So round two, HR 2954 passed the House Ways and Means Committee unanimously, so widely expected to become law. We wanted to get some of those changes on the table so you can start to sort of think about what is coming potentially down the pipeline. So Secure 2.0, which is this next round of legislation, is ultimately, like Secure 1.0, increasing the required minimum distribution age. It went from 70.5 to 72 previously. Now they're going to take the 72 and gradually increase it to 75 over the course of the next few years. So here's the years and the ages at which this thing is going to change. So on January 1 of 2022, so that's next year, the required minimum distribution age will change to 73. And then it will change to 74, basically 7 years later on January 1 of 29. And then 3 years after that, it is changing to 75 on January 1 of 1932. So fine, increase the required minimum distribution age, but here's the thing, and here's the thing you got to really kind of wrap your hands on when we talk about increasing required minimum distribution ages. First and foremost, for most people, it's kind of immaterial. Well over 80% of the folks that are retired out there are using their required minimum distribution to make monthly cash flow. They're retired, right? So they're taking money out of their investment accounts and retirement accounts that they've saved all their lives to enjoy their retirement. So this notion of you've got a sea of people out there that, they're only taking out the required minimum distribution, and the only reason why they're taking out a required minimum distribution from their retirement accounts is because they have to. And that's not the reality, right? I mean, come on. There's a very small percentage that is taking out the required minimum distribution simply because they have to. The vast majority of people are taking it because they're retired and they need income. That's simple, right? But hey, that doesn't stop Washington from kind of meddling in the middle of this. And so here's the things that you've got to be thinking about, right? So let's say you push off your required minimum distribution, you continue to push it off, and that's, understandable. You don't want the taxes until the last possible moment. Maybe you don't actually need it. Unlikely, but we'll go there. The reality is that you're letting your retirement account build up even more, right? If you don't take your required minimum distribution, then that stays in the account, continues to grow tax deferred, things like that. So what you're doing is you're only increasing your future required minimum distributions, right? By not taking the money out a little bit along the way, letting it continue to grow, you're basically increasing your future required minimum distributions. Okay, so that's the important thing, right? The other thing is, and come back to what we were saying at the beginning of this segment, biggest change under the first round of these retirement changes that we saw 18 months ago was to make your beneficiaries take out your retirement account, take the money out of an inherited retirement account over a 10-year period of time. So ultimately, by shortening that window, this notion of increasing the required minimum distribution age doesn't really add much to the table at the end of the day. It sounds great. It sounds like the politicians in Washington are being nice because, you don't have to take it. Reality is everybody's taking it anyway. A very small percentage of the population takes their required minimum distribution solely because they have to. Vast, vast, vast majority are taking it because they're retired and need income. Now, the longer you don't take money out of that retirement account, the more it builds. The more it builds, the bigger the problem it's going to be for your beneficiaries, because remember, they've got to take it out over a 10-year period of time. So it's one of those things where, they give and then they take away. So that's fine if the required minimum distribution age is increased. I don't think that is material. I don't think that necessarily changes anything. At the end of the day, it doesn't make people's retirement more secure, if you will. A secure retirement is predicated upon you doing stuff along the way, spending less than what you make, saving the difference, stuff like that. No amount of legislation in Washington is going to create better retirement for you unless you take personal responsibility for your finances. They can pass whatever legislation they want. It all comes, a successful retirement, a happy retirement, one that is financially in good shape, is dependent upon what you do along the way and how much you're spending and how much you're saving. They can pass whatever legislation they want unless they're going to pass legislation about encouraging personal responsibility. Anyway, digression, we're coming back. Here are some of the other pieces inside the latest proposal out of Washington in regards to your retirement. Now, this one, again, sort of okay. It goes back to the whole commentary we just had on personal responsibility. The other thing that this latest round of retirement proposal changes is that they want to expand auto enrollment of employees in employer-sponsored 401ks, 403bs, things like that. So once you're eligible, what they want to do is they want to automatically enroll you into your employer-sponsored plan to the tune of typically at least 3% on up to a maximum of 10%. And then every year, once you are subject to that auto enrollment, they're going to increase that percentage by 1% up to a maximum of 10%. Sort of a forced savings mechanism. And yeah, okay, I get it. Okay, a lot of people don't take that personal responsibility and ultimately set aside money for saving in retirement and things like that. But ultimately, fine, you want to increase auto enrollment. That ultimately is fine to do. But again, I don't think it really gets to the heart of the problem, which is, simply put, more of the societal problem involving personal responsibility. Anyway, we're digressing well into that topic. We're going to try and pull it back. The next item up for change is the indexing on IRA catch-up contributions. So right now, current law, if you're over age 50, you can put an extra $1,000 into an IRA, Roth. If you're similarly, if you have a employer retirement plan, you can put an extra $6,500 in if you're over age 50, whether it be a 401k or a 403b. Starting in the year 2023, the $1,000 extra contribution that you can do into an IRA, Roth, if you're over age 50, that's going to be indexed for inflation. Okay, fine, that's good, okay, because it should ultimately be indexed for inflation, particularly now with inflation as high as it is. That allows you to ultimately put in more money and ultimately raise that limit sort of automatically along the way. That's fine, we get it. The next one is a little odd, and it has to deal with that catch-up contribution that deals that involves 401ks and 403bs, and that's that extra $6,500 that you can do on top of the regular contribution limit, which is about $19,500. So those are the limits, and what this new piece of legislation is talking about doing is taking that extra catch-up of the $6,500 and ultimately increasing it to $10,000. But this is the weird part, only at ages 62, 63, and 64. Well, that's weird, right? Why? I mean, by the way, if you're in that bad of a shape where when you're 62, 63, 64, and you've got to really be like, oh my goodness, I really have to be able to have the opportunity to put in an extra $3,500 a year, and that's going to make the difference between a successful retirement and not, probably not going to work. Regardless, what's even weirder about it is the higher catch-up contribution that's being proposed at 65. So let's say you are still working because you're working, maybe you enjoy it, maybe you have to. The reality is that at 65, you're right back down to the normal catch-up limit, or 66 and 67. So if you're going to have an increased catch-up limit at a higher age, well, why not make that just at that age and going forward rather than just these 3 years? It's kind of a confusing kind of mechanism that they're doing. Other provisions involve the employees being able to match you can use that for student loan payments and things like that. We're going to slide to the break. When we get back from the break, I'm just going to wrap up this conversation with one important caveat on these proposed changes in Washington that you really need to be aware of in terms of the direction of where Washington is going. And here's the thing. The reality is that there is a money grab going on, which we're going to talk about after these messages. Talking about the latest proposed changes to your retirement coming out of Washington. Spent the prior segment sort of hitting the highlights on those increasing to required minimum distribution ages, increases to the catch-up contribution limits, increases to auto enrollments in employer-sponsored plans. Now we're going to kind of give you our take on what's really happening as it relates to those changes. So welcome back to Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. Central Florida's longest running radio program, also happen to be one of the top 25 financial planning podcasts on the World Wide Web. We welcome in this segment our listeners over on the Space Coast at 92.7 WMMB. My name is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner and certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where our team of certified financial fiduciary stands ready this week to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. So we've got all these retirement changes, right? We've got the Secure Act 1, which passed in December of 2019. We've got Secure 2, which unanimously passed the House Ways and Means Committee earlier this summer, and now appears to be slated for passage by the House. Seems likely that that might pass, but again, who knows? The bottom line is it is a proposed piece of legislation. Obviously, we will keep you informed on this program as to when, in fact, it does become law. But here's the thing about the fine print, and it started with the first round of this retirement changes, and it really does continue with this second round. Understand that the fine print in all of these changes is really about the revenue. The folks in Washington are spending money like unbelievably so, and at some point they turn to the revenue side of things, and ultimately you can't just keep borrowing money, at least I don't think you can, and so then you have to look at the revenue side. So what does revenue side mean to the federal government? It means taxes and how you collect them and when. So certainly the first round of major retirement changes that you saw 18 months ago did a big step in that direction when it eliminated the stretch IRA and shortened the period of time that you have to take money out of a retirement account that you inherit. You only got 10 years now. So that means they know that it is going to be a 10-year period of time whereby you wind up having to take the money out and ultimately having to pay taxes on it. Now, here's the curious thing. Why pick 10 years, right? I mean, why not 8? Why not 15? Where did the 10 years come from? Well, if you know anything about the folks in Washington, that's the maximum period of time upon which, when they pass a bill, that's the maximum period of time upon which they can sort of pull in the numbers into the bill when they're trying to justify its cost. So wasn't a random number. It was specifically tied to the period of time upon which the folks in Washington can count that revenue when they're sort of counting what's supposed to be going on with the revenue raise or the revenue increase on any piece of legislation. And so the proposed Secure 2.0, if you will, takes of that all a kind of a step further, but it does so in a little different perspective in terms of drawing the distinction between your traditional approach versus your Roth approach. And just to recap the differences between those approaches for our listeners, the traditional approach is you put the money in, you get a tax deduction today. When you take it out down the road, you wind up having to pay taxes, right? On a Roth approach, it's after-tax money, which means then that's revenue today to the federal government because you don't get a tax deduction for it, but when you take it out down the road, again, outside that 10-year window that they like to look at, then it's tax-free. So if I'm looking to generate more revenue, particularly over the next few years, because I've spent so darn much money over the past few years that I need to do something to stop the craziness, the reality is that they are now looking at more of these catch-up contributions, these additional amounts that you can put in beyond the traditional levels, as pushing those into the Roth side of the equation. So a lot of the fine print in here has to deal with sort of the Rothification of your retirement, which means that you don't get a choice if you're making those catch-up contributions to do them on a pre-tax basis. You've got to do them on an after-tax basis, which means that we, the federal government, get the revenue now. See how that all works? Ultimately, that's the piece of the fine print on this legislation that disturbs us a little bit, because it eliminates the option for folks to be able to choose which one may be right for them, all with the background of the fine print of, hey, we need the money now, so we're going to eliminate the ability to do it on a pre-tax basis, because that doesn't generate money now. So watch out for that. The Rothification of your retirement is afoot, particularly with this new piece of legislation. So certainly something you need to be aware of when it comes to that. They're after the money, and they're going to figure out how to get it. So be careful when they start passing wonderful, glorious pieces of legislation that ultimately have great sounding names, but at the core, it gets into your pocketbook. Anyway, speaking of your pocketbook, are you one of the millions of Americans who literally have left money behind in a 401k? Saw a recent study out of the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, where they estimate that over 24 million forgotten 401k accounts are out. 24 million forgotten, that's a staggering number, that in total hold over 1.35 trillion of the assets of hardworking Americans. On an annual basis, the numbers are that Americans leave behind about 2.8 million accounts each year. Stop and think about these numbers. There's only about $6.7 trillion in 401k. So we're talking like 15 to 20% of the entire amount that has been saved in these types of accounts. So what's the big deal with that? I mean, the reality is that it's sort of obvious, right? I mean, the first thing about when you leave your employer, right? If you leave your employer, you put all your stuff in a box, you take the pictures of the kids, take the little knickknacks, all that, and then you take that with you. Why would you do the same thing with your money? Lots of times it gets forgotten, particularly if you sign up for email delivery, right? And then if you use the email that is your work email, and now you're no longer at that company, then you no longer have that email, and then everything just gets kind of forgotten. So the reality is that when you leave your employer, you really want to take control of that money. That's obvious, right? The other less obvious issue where it really kind of comes into play and sort of undermines what your potential investments may look like is this notion of the investment allocation ultimately is going to change, and that is going to undermine what your performance might look like. I'm thinking just recently my wife's employer changed their 403b provider, and she had a variety of funds that we had selected in the prior version of that, and then it was going to get pushed over to this new plan, but it wasn't going to be pushed over into specific funds. It was going to be pushed over and mapped into a target date fund. Now, as you know, we're certainly not big fans of those target date funds. We've certainly spent a lot of time on prior podcasts and programs talking a lot about those types of funds and the limitations behind them. The reality is that you've got a situation where a lot of employers will change their plans on a regular basis in an effort to try and reduce costs. That's understandable. But what happens is that ultimately means that you really do lose track of and lose control of exactly how that money is getting invested. So what to do? Well, first of all, don't lose track of it, right? Make sure you are taking the time, taking the opportunity to bring that over with you. And whether that's rolling it over to your current plan, your new plan at your new employer, assuming that they've got a broad range of investment choices, that's fantastic. That's one option you can do. The other option you can do is you can roll it over to an individual retirement account. If there's a Roth piece, then obviously that Roth piece has to go to a Roth IRA. The pre-tax pieces go to an IRA. There's a process there, as with anything, particularly when you're dealing with something that could trigger tax implications. But the bottom line is, don't lose track of it. Don't be part of this 24 million accounts that have been completely forgotten out there. Don't lose track of it. Make sure you take the time to do the right thing with it, roll it over, put it over into something that is going to continue to allow you to at least keep an eye on it and make sure that the investment allocation is where it needs to be. We're going to slide to a break. When we get back from the break, we're going to talk about some of the signs that you need to be thinking of to make sure that your retirement is on track. Coming up next here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris. Welcome back to the program, ladies and gentlemen. This segment of the program, we're going to be talking about some of the signs that might indicate that you're in decent shape for retirement, right? So hopefully you can check the box on maybe all of these signs, particularly if you're retired or approaching retirement. Welcome to Dollars and Cents, Central Florida's longest running radio program. My name is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary with Nelson Financial Planning, where our team of certified financial fiduciary stands ready this week even. I'm sure they've got some time to be able to visit with you this week at the office to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan that produces superior investment results and provides you with peace of mind for the future. So what are some of those signs that you're in good shape from a retirement perspective? Well, I guess it starts with the income versus the expenses, right? You don't have more debt than you had a year ago, right? I mean, if the amount of debt that you have from one year to the next constantly increases, then that's a pretty negative trend, if you will. If you're retired and you had that first year of retirement and found that, hey, I'm doing okay with the amount of income that I'm getting, then certainly that is a very good position to be in. Perhaps the easiest way to measure that, and this is perhaps one of the biggest general rules of thumb out there when it comes to sort of looking at your income and looking at your assets and trying to determine the appropriate level of income from them. The reality is that the 4% rule, if you will, is a rule that says ultimately, if you've got X number of dollars, if you take 4% of that, and that would generally be the amount of income that you can get on retirement. If you don't like using percentages, then you can just take the amount and divide by 25, gets you the same number, and ultimately that gives you some level or some idea of the amount of income you can draw from your total assets. Another thing to be looking at in terms of some of the signs that you're on track for retirement or having a decent retirement is that you're a little bit more thoughtful about how you use your cash, right? I mean, let's take a look at like the stimulus checks, things like that you might have gotten out of the blue over the course of the past few years, past few months. What did you do with those? Did you use those because, oh my goodness, I needed to pay the bills, or were you able to save those? If you're able to save those, then obviously that means that you're in a little bit better financial shape and ultimately wind up having an adequate emergency savings. But again, if that cash goes right to splurging or spending, then ultimately that may put you on a little bit of a difficult trajectory. Speaking of cash, you want to certainly make sure that you've got a decent size emergency savings account. Make sure you haven't whittled away at that during the course of the first few years of retirement, because ultimately that emergency savings account is supposed to be used for emergencies, whether you're retired or whether you're working. Those types of accounts, of course, very important to have. Here's one, and I think a lot of folks sort of struggle with that. but this would certainly be one where we would encourage you to do, particularly as you get older, because as you get older, you get more susceptible to scams and to different types of financial inventions, if you will, that might be out there that really, at the end of the day, are not appropriate. And so this one involves, just talking with people about the financial decisions that you can make. Maybe it's your family, maybe it's friends, maybe it's an advisor, lawyer, CPA, financial guy. The reality is that having those discussions will at least help you talk through what exactly it is that you're thinking about doing. It's so important to have those conversations and to talk about what you're thinking about doing from a financial perspective, just to kind of bounce those ideas off and make sure that you are not running into any issues that you're going to later regret. I think particularly as folks age, and I think just in general, Americans, kind of have a tendency to not want to talk about their finances, like to friends and family and things like that. But that becomes more and more of an issue as you age, because you become more susceptible to scams and things like that. So you really want to make sure you've got some open channels of communication to see and to provide a discussion of some of the opportunities that may be put in front of you. So that's certainly something to do, and a good sign that your retirement is on track if you're having those open and honest conversations. And then similarly, you think about what's gone on over the past 18 months or so. Obviously, the start of the pandemic in February and March of last year led to a pretty quick and significant market decline. How did you feel about that? How did you fare? What's the results look like? Those are the kinds of things to really sort of give a gut check, if you will, on exactly how your investments are set up, because that is a good test, if you will, on sort of how your investments are going to perform during difficult periods of time. How did they do? How have they performed since then? Those are the kinds of things to be really kind of be thinking about, in a good way to kind of do a checkpoint, if you will, on your retirement savings. And then lastly, you should certainly at least annually be giving yourself some kind of a money checkup, right? Sit down, go over everything, money in, money out, the overall financial picture, and ultimately what the investment allocation looks like. It's a great time to use those as an opportunity to rebalance your accounts. And that's not something you necessarily have to do every year, but you certainly want to check it every year. Some years, like this year, I think there's more of a need to rebalance because of how well the market has done, not just this past year, but over the course of the past few years. So again, those are some of the signs to just kind of make sure that your retirement is on track. We're going to wrap it on up and get on out of here. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thanks for listening to the program. This has been Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning on Dollars and Cents.